Okay, so we spent some time thinking about stability and instability, and I hope that you found that helpful. And at the same time, I think it can still be rather esoteric or a bit abstract. I love the way that we start asking very pertinent questions in your context about how things might change if we assume that there's more instability than stability. But I want to push on this idea of empathy even a little bit further because I think it's going to help you. So I want to talk about empathy and listening. And this is really going to be important to you because in a few weeks, you're going to be interviewing teenagers and then working on your listening project assignment. So I hope that you'll find this really, really helpful. So one of the books that I'm having you read, and it's one that we developed, was called Sticky Faith Innovation, How Your Compassion, Creativity, and Courage Can Support Teenagers' Lasting Faith. This particular project came out of the research that we did. It was a nationwide project and it had 3 one-year cohorts. So we had multiple times that we ran a bunch of church leaders through it. We worked with over 51 churches, over 100 youth leaders, and probably over 1,000 young people completed pre and post assessment. So this was more than just like us coming up with some neat ideas that we thought we would share with anybody. We wanted to really test our process of working with church leaders to try to help them think about, well, what does empathy look like and how might we actually help them really support young people? So our research had over 13 denominations. We had 8 non-denominational communities. And these were both small and large congregations. Super important, right? Because perhaps you're in a congregation that's small or large. Sometimes we can assume that one is better than the other. That's not really the case. We really wanted to look at a bunch of different ones. And our objective was pretty simple. We wanted to develop both innovative approaches and innovative leaders that support adolescents in the spaces where they need the most support from the church, but where the church often feels less equipped to help. Maybe you've felt that, especially as you've been through the pandemic, right? Like all bets were off like during the pandemic. And now you've sort of come back from that because the pandemic is quote unquote over, which just doesn't necessarily feel over because a lot of your students are still working through sort of the ripple effect of that experience and are thinking through a lot of things. Though the world has changed, the assumptions have changed. People are coming back needing different things from you. Perhaps you felt all that as well. So we know that young people are looking for support. I believe, and I think you do as well, that church and faith communities actually have something really wonderful to give young people. And at the same time, I think that communities are feeling less sure as to how to actually do it. Like, how do I help a young person? And so it's real. And if it feels like it's hard, it's because it is, okay? Like that, I think, is just really important for us to understand. And so we started to think about how do we use Christian practices and innovative approaches to actually get to that point. Now, we're going to unpack a lot of the concepts from this book throughout the quarter. I'm not going to run through everything in the book in this lecture, but I do want to focus in on the first section. Our guiding question for this is based on empathizing with young people in their states of instability. Remember, we've talked about that. How might we reimagine Christian practices to facilitate formational growth of young people's identity, belonging, and purpose? Okay, so we really wanted to actually think about this idea of Christian practices. Now, I'm going to answer my own question that I asked you in the first lecture, right? Like, what does ministry look like for a young person who's living in the space of instability where perhaps they have a bit of in-motion lives? Well, perhaps a program isn't going to actually be able to keep up with their unstable in-motion lives because a program is very predictable. It is always on a particular day at a particular time in a particular space, right? And so a lot of times, while some young people can make that, and it's okay if they do, and it's really great if they do, others can't. So what do we do? Well, perhaps Christian practices are something that young people can learn and take with them wherever they go, right? Now, notice how we're thinking about this, right? If I've developed the Christian practice of prayer or Sabbath or compassion or scripture reading, or whatever it might be, bearing witness, whatever it might be, if I'm able to develop that and someone helps me with that, then no matter where I go, no matter what I do, I have this Christian practice that I can take with me. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah. So that's sort of the heartbeat of what we're trying to do with this project. Now, one of the questions that I think haunts us as we talk with ministry leaders was this: young people have changed. There's no question about it, right? Like the freshmen that are coming into your ministries this year are very, very different than the seniors who came into your ministries as freshmen 4 years ago, right? So we know that something has changed. So if young people have changed, why should young youth ministry stay the same? We know it can't. But sometimes there are forces, expectations to actually do that. And so we want to actually challenge that a little bit. My friend, Brad Griffin, said this once in a conversation. We're always trying to work on the way we talk about different things that we're learning. And he brought up this idea that oftentimes I think people default to default imaginations. Young people have changed. We know that youth ministry has to change, so we have to come up with new ideas, right? The problem is that new ideas often default to default imaginations. They'll say things like, one time I remember what we did was, last year, what we did was, I remember once when our youth group did, you see what's happening there? Default imaginations look to the past and remember something that worked really great, and then that is tried and superimposed to the present and the future. Okay. Now, whatever happened in the past, great. Like if you had a great experience, that is so awesome. We honor that experience. We honor the people that did what they did there and everything that comes with that. But just because it worked then doesn't mean it works now or in the future, right? And so one of the challenges that we have is to resist defaulting in the way that we imagine things and think about something different. One more thing about this, I'm on a roll right now. Like a lot of times, I'm sure you've never had this happen, but you probably have, is you've probably had a well-meaning adult in your community come up to you and say like, hey, what's going on with kids today? When I was in youth group, we found that if we did this concert or had this little campfire, or if we went to this location, you know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about? Like people have had a deep experience that they experienced, and they think that somehow young people today will actually think that that experience will be good for them as well. Now, it may or may not be. That might be true, but that's not a good way for us to think about being creative in ministry and thinking about the changes that are happening. All that empathy right there. We're just sort of connecting, right? Okay, so let's keep going. So if young people have changed, where does youth ministry need to happen? This is sort of the question. Now, this is going to be a little conceptual, but I think it's really, really important. I think one of the things that we have to do when we think about empathy is to think about the fact that young people live in a current narrative. Now, I think narratives are really, really important because true belief here. I actually don't think that young people and people run around trying to just be rebellious. Okay, now I'll unpack that a little bit. They're not just looking to screw up their lives or to get things wrong or anything like that. What I believe is this, is that everybody is doing their best to live and succeed in the narrative that they believe about the world. Okay? So if the world has minimal resources and I'm afraid that I'm not going to get my fair share, I will live a competitive life because I want to get something before it's gone, right? If the world is a shameful place where we are easily exposed and manipulated, then I will live a very cautious life that won't reveal much because I don't want to get hurt. See what I'm saying? So a lot of times for young people, they have a narrative in their head. A lot of times that narrative has been passed down to them through their family of origin or through an experience that they've had or whatever they're going through, right? There's a narrative that's playing in their head that often shapes their behaviors. And that's what's really, really important. Because I think a lot of times when we look at the behaviors of young people, we superimpose our narratives on what's happening there, and we judge them for their actions, which actually isn't the reason for their actions. Okay. So one of the challenges that we have then with young people is to actually understand their current narratives. What is the story that they're telling themselves? How do they think the world works? How do they succeed in this world that they have imagined in their heads? Now, chances are this current narrative is based with fact and fiction. With things that are true and things that are not, right? But the reality is it doesn't matter if it's true or not. We have to understand what their narratives are so that we can mentor them well. Otherwise, all we do is we basically judge their behaviors that are out of context, and that is not empathy, and that's not helpful to them. So the current narratives, and part of the impulse and job for us as ministry leaders, is to understand the narratives of young people and what's informing their decisions, their worries, their cares, their hopes, their dreams, and all that comes with that. Make sense? Okay. Now, what we also have as we conceptualized and worked on this project is we recognize the fact that there are Jesus-centered narratives. Okay, we believe as Christians that that Jesus is inviting us to the best kind of life, right? A life that's full, a life that's free, a life that's allows people to be all that they were created to be, right? And so this Jesus-centered narrative, in many ways, is what we imagine Jesus would speak to our young people and kind of saying, "This is what I'm calling you to. Here's the better way. Here's what we're thinking about." Now, what we have to be careful with the Jesus-centered narrative, it's not just like we can use Jesus as sort of like, like the answer for everything. Like, I know why you're struggling, Jesus. I know why you're sad, Jesus. I know why you're anxious and stressed out, Jesus. Mental health, Jesus, right? That's not the point. The point is that if in the current narrative, a young person says, I feel anxious about my life because it seems like things are falling apart, and that makes me incredibly afraid. We can imagine what Jesus would say to that young person. You don't need to be afraid. I'm with you in the craziness. I'm not going to leave you. I am here for you because your life matters. And we're going to get through this because I love and I care for you, right? That's good news for a young person. That's the narrative. That's the gospel that we're trying to communicate. So what we have to do when we think about the gospel is we have to think about a Jesus-centered narrative that actually speaks to the current narratives that young people are actually going through, right? This takes a little bit more work, right? I can't, remember we've talked about this before, I can't shout Jesus from distance. I actually have to get a little bit closer and understand their narrative so that we can begin to help them believe that Jesus is calling them to something that's better, that's more helpful, that actually answers and addresses some of the challenges that they're going through. Okay. Now, the challenge here is to live somehow and think about the tension between the current narrative and the Jesus narrative. Okay. The model breaks down a little bit. It's not like, current narratives are all bad and then there's Jesus narrative and it's all good. It's more like current narratives are probably mixed, as I mentioned before, with good and bad, but the Jesus-centered narrative calls us to even a better way to live, and maybe a different way to think about things as we think about the gospel. And I think this is where ministry actually is, okay? The problem a lot of times, I think, in youth ministry is we can spend all our time in the current narratives and just be like, we're hanging out with the kids, but we never call them to a better way of living. The other way that we can do youth ministry is that we can spend all our time shouting Jesus from the distance, but never get to know them very well. Ministry lives in this deep and profound tension between current narratives and Jesus narratives, and we are trying to negotiate and navigate that all the time. And if you feel the pressure of that, if you feel the challenge of that, if you feel the stress of that, and you feel the angst of that, welcome to youth ministry, right? And so maybe this slide just kind of goes, oh, That's what I'm going through. Yep, it is. I mean, and so this is where we need the skill to work within the space. So how will we work within that space? Well, the book talks about the fact that we really landed on three things. We need compassion, we need creativity, and we need courage. Now, the good news is this, is that you have these things. It's not that you don't have them, but we just have to continue to grow in them and not assume that the way that we have maybe developed them up to this point is all that we need. We actually need something more. And this is the discipline that comes with this sort of this idea of innovation. Now, the book talks about the fact that we move through compassion, creativity, and courage, and then we constantly are working on this. You can see that this is more than just coming up with a program. It's actually a posture by which we can actually live our ministry lives, which I hope that will become very familiar to you in the weeks ahead. For now, I just want to talk about this idea of compassion for a second and what we mean by that. So to empathize, as I've mentioned before, is more than good intentions. It's the skill of seeing young people where they are and meeting them where they need us the most. Not where we want them, but where they say they need us the most. And so we ask the question, and I think empathy asks this question, what's good news for young people? What's good news for a middle school boy who walks into a lunchroom and he doesn't have friends? What's good news for a teenage girl who is recognizing the fact that her body doesn't look like her friends and she feels self-conscious about it? What's good news to a young person that maybe had their first sort of romantic experience and now they've broken up? What's it like for a kid to go through a parent's divorce and not know where to turn? What's good news for them? You see what I'm talking about? Like, that's what we have to be thinking about, because that's where the good news lands, which is not uncommon as we look at the Gospels, right? I mean, Jesus is like, what do you want from me? And, you know, people are like, I want to get well. I want to be healed. I want food, right? Like, so this tangible aspect of good news is really, really crucial in youth ministry. Now, the way that we empathize is we have to really interpret what we're empathizing then, right? Like, if I am empathizing and I get to know the narrative of a young person, that's really great. But one of the things that we need to take it further is to begin to then interpret, well, what's actually going on here? Like, what does this mean as we talk with teenagers? And the three lenses that we use often in our research and our work at the Fuller Youth Institute is this idea of identity, belonging, and purpose. Identity asks the question, who am I? Belonging asks the questions, where do I fit? And purpose is, what difference can I make? Now, these are teenage questions that are asked all the time, but I think they're just people questions. We're all asking questions about our own identity, belonging, and purpose. I think for a young person, they just feel it more intensely because for the first time, as their brains are developing, they're able to think abstractly and actually think about, like, yeah, who am I? Like, where do I fit in community and friendship and in this world? And like, what difference can I make? Like, what am I becoming? Like, what's my fingerprint going to be on this world? I guarantee that when you talk with young people, if you listen for identity, belonging, and purpose, you will actually hear it in the ways that they talk about things. I hate my friends. They aren't there for me. Belonging, right? You know, identity, purpose. I mean, I can give you examples of all those, but you see what I'm talking about? So these are the ways that we can use these lenses to understand and listen more closely to the current narrative that young people begin to reveal and tell us about, okay? Now, this idea of living and with compassion in between the current and the Jesus-centered narratives and allows us to ministry sometimes can run into some problems. Two really quick ones that I'll talk about, and I mention more of this in the book, is this idea of closeness bias and intragenerational speed, okay? Now, closeness bias is this understanding that the closer I am to somebody, the less I stop asking them questions and the more I really don't know them, okay? Now, this is true for, like, for example, like if you've got a couple that's been married for decades, but they've really stopped really engaging each other. They can be married, but they actually are really, really far apart, right? Sometimes this happens with parents and teenagers. Parents and kids have lived together their whole lives, but they've stopped really seeking each other out. And as a result, they're sort of under the same roof, but they don't really talk with each other. right? I think this can happen in youth ministry as well, where as youth leaders, we can be very, very comfortable with teenagers. We've done it for so long. We know how to have conversations with them. We feel comfortable in youth room or like Sunday school youth class or whatever, right? Like a lot of adults don't. So like that's a superpower that you have. The problem, however, is this, is that I can, if I'm not careful, rely on the successes that I've had with doing youth ministry in the past that makes me assume that I understand how to do youth ministry now. Closeness bias keeps me from asking and being curious about the teenagers that are in front of us. And I think this is important for us to understand personally and also with our volunteers that we work with, that the teenagers that show up in our youth ministries this year are different than they were last year. Okay. It's not completely, but different enough that we can't make assumptions. Instead, we have to continue to have empathy, to lean in, to listen to their current narratives and understand where they're coming from. Make sense? Okay. Secondly, there's also something called intra-generational speed. And I talked a little bit about this in a previous lecture, right? The world is moving faster. Okay. The shared overlap of shared experiences is becoming less and less. And this is especially true, again, for youth leaders and volunteers to recognize the fact that just because I was a teenager once doesn't mean I understand teenagers today. I have to work harder to find places of commonality and conversation to help that happen. And so I think sometimes this is really, really important as you work with your volunteers, because some volunteers come in to ministry thinking like they're going to have great relationships with teenagers. They're going to change a teenager's life. You've heard all these things before. And then they get really frustrated because they don't know how to talk with teenagers. Well, that's the moment to not say that they're bad at what they do, but to bring up this idea that perhaps there's this intra-generational speed and there's just less commonality and overlap. And so we have to work harder to have empathy, to listen to understand and know the teenagers that we are working with. Okay. So that really, really helps this whole particular process. So compassion then is about seeking out young people. It's about empathizing with them, as we've talked about, and it's for listening for their answers and their current narratives through the lenses of identity, belonging, and purpose. Okay. When we begin to live in this sort of way, we teach ourselves the discipline of stepping a little bit closer, not making assumptions, and seeing young people where they're at and listening to their stories so that we can understand and interpret their actions as we get to know them better. Okay, so some self-questions. Who are the young people I listen to? Here's another question. Who's missing? Do I always go to the same young people? And are there other ones in my realm that I need to be paying more attention to and getting to know their stories as well? Secondly, how do I know young people feel listened to? You know, how do you know? I mean, not that you've just done it, but how do you know? I would argue that one of the ways is that they just open up a little bit more. There's a little bit more trust that comes that way, and trust takes time. Thirdly, what are my students' quests for identity, belonging, and purpose, and how might that shape the focus of my ministry? If I listen closely to what their longings are, to what they're raising. And as I think about these questions of identity, belonging, and purpose, how might these categories actually shape the way I think about the work and teaching that I'm doing? I hope that's helpful. I think this gives us maybe a much more robust way of thinking about empathy and about compassion. And this is something that when we do this right, we can really build on that and really create, I think, a responsive ministry to where people are at. So with that in mind, let me just leave you with this, my friends. May you know that the steps you take toward young people are needed and beautiful. May you know that there are times when you take those steps that things don't go as well, and that is not a failure on your part. It's simply an opportunity to learn. May you be aware of the identity, belonging, and purpose questions that teenagers are wrestling with, and may you be aware that those same questions are latent and deep even in your own journeys as well. And through it all, may you know God's grace and peace.